I want to just delve into the underlying issue here about whether we should think about former presidents or other top leaders being immunized from being prosecuted because only banana republics prosecute political opponents, or whether we should view presidents like any other citizen, or former presidents as any other citizen, and we should prosecute them when they break the law the way we do every other citizen. I have very strong views on that, in part because I wrote a book about it in 2011, and in part because the reporting I did in 2019 and 2020 here in Brazil related very, very directly to that principle. So first of all, let me show you the cover of the book that I wrote. You see it there on the screen. It's called With Liberty and Justice for Some. It was published in 2011. And the entire purpose of that book, there you can see the subtitle. It's How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful. So that gives you a sense of what this book was. This book was written in the wake of the announcement by President Obama that although he believed that the Bush administration and leaders of the CIA committed serious crimes as part of the war on terror, namely instituting camps of torture around the world, which has always been considered a crime internationally and domestically, and because he ran in 2008 and won in 2008 based on a promise to be open-minded about whether those responsible for those war and terror crimes should be prosecuted. That was one of the promises he made in the 2008 election. I was covering it at the time. He said, this is not something that should be decided in advance. People who work for the CIA, who work for the Bush administration, are citizens like everybody else, and if they committed crimes, they should be prosecuted for those crimes. We don't have a two-tiered system of justice in the United States, he said. And he said, I'd be very open to it. I'm going to hand it to my attorney general, and if he determines that crimes were committed, they will be prosecuted the way any other would. But what happened instead is, the minute that President Obama was elected, the question became, early on in his administration, are you really going to follow through on your promise about whether or not to prosecute people you believe, or the Justice Department concludes, broke the law, even though those people are top officials of the CIA who approved this torture regime, or even people who worked at the Bush White House, who orchestrated and implemented it, like Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and others, Donald Rumsfeld. And in January of 2009, so 9 days before Obama's inauguration, he was interviewed by ABC News' George Stephanopoulos, who of course used to be an official in the Clinton White House. And Stephanopoulos raised that issue with him about whether President Obama, or President-elect Obama, intended to follow through on those commitments. Here's what he said.
The most popular question on your own website is related to this, on change.gov. It comes from Bob Furtick. Will you appoint a special prosecutor, ideally Patrick Fitzgerald, to independently investigate the gravest crimes of the Bush administration, including torture and warrantless wiretapping?
We're still evaluating how we are going to approach the whole issue of interrogations, detentions, and so forth. And obviously we're going to be looking at past practices. And I don't believe that anybody is above the law. On the other hand, I also have a belief that we need to look forward as opposed to looking backwards. And part of my job is to make sure that, for example, at the CIA, you've got extraordinarily talented people who are working very hard to keep Americans safe. I don't want them to suddenly feel like they've got to spend all their time looking over their shoulders and lawyering.
So no 9/11 commission with independent subpoena power?
You know, we have not made final decisions, but my instinct is for us to focus on how do we make sure that moving forward we are doing the right thing. That doesn't mean that if somebody has blatantly broken the law that they are above the law, but my orientation is going to be to move forward.
So let me just press that one more time. You're not ruling out prosecution, but will you tell your Justice Department to investigate these cases and follow the evidence wherever it leads?
What I think my general view when it comes to my Attorney General is he's the people's lawyer. Eric Holder's been nominated. his job is to uphold the Constitution and look after the interests of the American people, not to be swayed by my day-to-day politics. So ultimately, he's going to be making some calls. But my general belief is that when it comes to national security, what we have to focus on is getting things right in the future, as opposed to looking at what we got wrong in the past.
You know, you mentioned Eric Holder.
Now, in a lot of ways, that was such classic Obama. As I sat there and listened to that, I haven't seen that until just now in quite a while. Because in every 10 seconds, he's affirming contrary principles, which is what he was a master at doing. If you wanted to hear one principle affirmed, nobody's above the law, he gave you that. If you wanted to hear the principle that the CIA officials who tortured are patriotic Americans who love their country and shouldn't be punished for that, and we should look forward and fix our problems and not look backward vindictively, you've got to hear that as well. Completely contradictory principles that he affirmed. He did that all the time. But you'll notice that, as George Stephanopoulos said at the start, they set up on his website a ranking system. This was part of the genius of the Obama circle. They had a bunch of internet experts, and they were able to rank the questions of greatest importance to those who had just voted for him. And that was the number one question on that site, as voted for by his own supporters. Will you actually follow through on your promise to prosecute the people who the Justice Department concludes committed crimes, which is what he repeatedly promised to do. And you heard him say, although it was, again, in between completely contradictory statements, that nobody's above the law, and if the Justice Department concludes that there were crimes committed, then they should be held accountable. But he quickly added, my inclination as Obama, the president, who just got done saying it's not for me to decide, I'm letting you know, and I'm letting Eric Holder know, my orientation is we shouldn't do that, because we should leave well enough alone. Now, this idea that we should look forward and not backward, it's a nice one, but there is no such thing as a criminal prosecution that doesn't look backward. That's the whole point of a criminal prosecution, is someone did something in the past that was illegal, and then you look backward and you say, what is it they did? And the whole point of punishing them is not to be vindictive, it's to make for a better future going forward, because it sends the signal that you actually can't break the law, that if you do, you're going to be punished. Otherwise, there's no incentive to abide by it. And very shortly after that claim, in February or March, President Obama implemented a policy. Even though he said it was for Eric Holder to decide who gets prosecuted and who doesn't, he announced immunity, full-scale immunity for anyone involved in what was then called the Enhanced Interrogation Program. Now, leave aside whether you believe in torture or not, whether you thought it was right to use it or not. There were other crimes committed as part of the war on terror as well, including spying on American citizens without the warrants required by law that courts ultimately ruled were unconstitutional. There were a lot of crimes committed in the name of the war on terror. And when President Obama announced this immunity, I was vehemently opposed to it. And I wrote about it frequently. So just as one example, here in August of 2012, the article I wrote in The Guardian, I was at The Guardian at the time, reads, Obama's Justice Department grants final immunity to Bush's CIA torturers. And I'll get to the details of this article in just a second. But it was essentially the kind of final blow. They closed all the remaining cases that left open at least a possibility that somebody who tortured in a particularly gruesome and violent and barbaric way, even ones that deviated from the torture rules that had been authorized, could be prosecuted. They closed every single case. And so immunity had been bestowed in full to the CIA and the Bush administration. And that was the event that prompted me to write that 2011 book. Because at the time, and maybe it was naive, I thought it was bizarre that essentially everybody in the media was in agreement that nobody should be prosecuted for things they did as part of the Bush administration on the grounds that we should look forward and not backward. I thought to myself, we're in a country in which more of our citizens are imprisoned than any country in the world, both in terms of absolute numbers, even though countries like China and India have far, far, far larger populations. We imprison more of our citizens than any other country in the world, including those much more populous countries, and by proportion. Not just in terms of raw numbers, but more citizens proportionally as well. And there's all kinds of statistics that illustrate how extreme that is, including the fact that America is 5% of the world's population, meaning if you're an American citizen, only 5% of the world's population are Americans, and yet 25% of the world's prison population is in the United States. So we are a country that does absolutely believe in imprisoning people, far more than almost any other country. And the idea that suddenly when it comes to senior political officials or former presidents or CIA leaders, we have a principle that says they cannot be prosecuted even if they committed crimes. Notice, Obama wasn't saying they didn't commit crimes. He always said he thought they did. He was saying, even though they committed crimes, I don't think they should be prosecuted because we need to look forward and not backward. I found that bizarre. And so I went to write a book trying to find the roots of where this principle came from. This principle that while we imprison working class people and poor people in gigantic numbers, we don't imprison senior political officials except in the most extreme cases, usually when they offend other elites or victimize other elites. And what I found was that the root of this principle was the pardon of Richard Nixon by Gerald Ford. I don't know if we have that video yet, but Gerald Ford, when he decided to pardon Richard Nixon, and most historians know that that was part of the deal, that Ford would be named vice president, would become president in exchange for his agreement to prosecute Richard Nixon, to pardon Richard Nixon, instead of allowing the prosecution to go forward. He enunciated principles, and he did not say, I'm pardoning Richard Nixon because I don't believe he committed crimes. He created this framework that the media now believes in that says, if you are an important enough person, you're a president, you're somebody who people value, you're very important to the economy, then the harms from prosecuting you are so great. We'll have political disruption and turmoil. Everyone will focus on these things instead of the things we need to focus on, that essentially, if you're important enough, you have immunity. We will pardon you in the name of the public good. We will immunize you. We will protect you. Now, again, the pardon of Richard Nixon by Gerald Ford was a very complicated and controversial decision. So I'm not suggesting that you look at that in isolation. I'm suggesting you don't. You may be somebody who thought that was the right decision. It's really worth going back and digging into the history of that, as I did for that book, because that was an unheard of principle. By which I do not mean that prior to the pardon of Nixon, the American justice system was equal. Of course, it's always been the case, and always will be the case, that if you're very wealthy and powerful, as a rule, you will be less likely to be prosecuted or convicted or imprisoned because you can hire the best lawyers, and for lots of other reasons. It was the first time it was enunciated so explicitly by the political class that certain people are too important to be prosecuted because of the turmoil they will create. That was the argument for President Obama's refusal and his Justice Department's refusal to prosecute anybody who committed systemic fraud that led to the 2008 financial crisis. Apologists will say none of them committed real crimes. There was plenty of evidence of criminality, but you can hear Obama, you can hear Eric Holder, you can hear Timothy Geithner, Obama's Treasury Secretary, using this principle, first enunciated by Ford, that our economy can't withstand the turmoil and disruption of prosecuting major Wall Street institutions when we're so fragile as an economy. So we got re-invoked to protect Wall Street. It got re-invoked to protect people who committed crimes. And this is the standard principle of our elite class. You could almost find nobody who worked for corporate media who thought that CIA torturers or criminals in the Bush administration should be prosecuted. Almost none. The same thing happened in the Iran-Contra scandal, where George Bush I, 41, pardoned all kinds of officials in his own administration and the Reagan administration, even though he himself was implicated by that prosecution, and everybody applauded. There's a liberal columnist for the Washington Post, Richard Cohen, who's been around for so many years that he was probably writing before Joe Biden went to the Senate. And he had a famous column where he said, Cap Weinberger walks free and I'm cheering. And it was all about how he knows Cap Weinberger. He sees him at the Safeway in Washington. He knows him. He likes him. He's not the kind of person that should be inside a criminal courtroom. This has been the ethos for decades, that we do not prosecute former political officials. That's something that's done only in third world countries. And I wrote a book arguing against that principle, saying that we cannot have an immunity for our elite class, because if we do, you incentivize lawbreaking the same way as you incentivize lawbreaking if you allow ordinary citizens to go unpunished when they break the law. So I am not somebody who believes that inherently Donald Trump should be immunized from prosecution because he's too important. I'm not somebody who believes that because there be political turmoil, we should not prosecute a former president, Donald Trump or anyone else, if he actually committed serious crimes. I'm not somebody who believes that. I believe the opposite, that it is very dangerous to immunize political elites. And that's what this Guardian article was about. That's what that book was about. I've been arguing this for a long time. So I say all that to make clear that I am not on board this view that Trump should just be inherently immunized from prosecution because he's a former president, or even because he's leading in the polls to be the new president. That's not something I believe. I think that's a very dangerous thing. I think banana republics, or whatever you want to call them, third world countries, however you want to disparage other countries, sometimes they do prosecute political officials for political reasons, but oftentimes what defines a banana republic is that the law is only for the powerless and not for the powerful, not for elites. Elites break the law with impunity, and jails are only for the powerless. That, to me, is what defines a banana republic, a two-tiered system of justice that I do not favor. This is not an indictment that triggers that principle. I absolutely think that it's appropriate in cases of serious criminality to prosecute a former president or prosecute a leading presidential candidate if you have compelling evidence, A, compelling evidence, B, of a serious crime that has been committed, and C, a process that is guaranteed to be apolitical, so that we can be assured that this is not about abusing the law toward partisan or political or ideological ends. All three of those elements are not just missing, but are completely assaulted by this prosecution in Manhattan. You cannot find a worse example to abandon this principle. This principle that I've been arguing for more than a decade, that political elites should be just as susceptible to prosecution when they commit serious crimes as anybody else, has probably never been more weakened than it is today by this preposterous prosecution that is so overtly and transparently politicized about a joke of a case that makes a complete mockery of that principle and of the entire justice system, and that is motivated by such political objectives that it's embarrassing and shameful. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.